When you jump off an aircraft carrier into the open water, you have to consider that you're in a whole new food chain, and you ain't at the top. But these swimmers realize this. That's why there is a gunner on top of the ship, constantly watching out for sharks. And if anything, the idea is simple. Aim at the person swimming closest to the shark. That should give enough time for everyone else to get out of the water. But jokes aside, shooting at a shark in the water would be a completely ineffective tactic at neutralizing the shark. At best, it can scare a unicorn. And at worst, the bullets may skip off the surface rather than penetrate the water and injure nearby swimmers. After all, sharks are cautious creatures, and before attacking, they tend to circle around and inspect their prey for an extended period of time. That's why having a dedicated lookout is actually a great idea, but shooting at the shark is not. Bullets shot into the water either fragment within a few feet or come to a full stop in less than 6 feet or so. That's why when you shoot bullets at the water, it looks more like a small explosion, as bullets disintegrate into pieces. In order for the bullets to not rupture, they would have to have a different shape, like needles. And that's exactly how underwater bullets look like. The hydrodynamics is very different from shooting bullets in the atmosphere. Even Mythbusters found that a .50 caliber bullet would travel only 1 foot into the water before it loses its lethality. According to the Mythbusters, bullets shot from smaller handguns can actually travel further, about 6 feet. Therefore, even if you hit a shark, you would likely piss it off even more, which would cause the shark to reflexively attack a swimmer. To be fair to the shark, it doesn't know that it was shot by a gunman from the surface and not the nearby swimmer. But swim calls are only one of the big-ticket fun activities for Navy sailors on warships, with the others including steel beach parties and the occasional beer. But the true celebration involves shooting guns into the sky. Swim calls serve as a great morale-boosting activity for the sailors, and they make for amazing stories down the road, but they look quite different from the 1940s. Back during the good old days, before the invention of safety, sailors were allowed to jump from anywhere, like the flight deck of an aircraft carrier which sits 60 feet high above the water. Or even sailors climbing the anchor chain and then diving down. Mind you, it looks like these divers knew what they were doing. There is even a story about how one Olympic swimmer was allowed to dive from the top of the island. But today, the Navy is much more risk-averse than it was in the past. Now, jumping from 60 feet above the water cannot kill you. But if you land wrongly, it definitely can. Get ready for sprains and potential drownings. But don't worry, there's always a rescue boat nearby. Falling on the water wrong can be worse than falling on concrete. Yes, they both can break bones, but there is no risk of drowning in concrete. Today, sailors jump off a lowered elevator from the hangar bay, and that's about 30 feet. But it's still too high for many. And if you're not afraid of heights, then besides sharks, there is venomous jellyfish and sea snakes to worry about. The safest way to swim, if you're stationed on a ship that has a well deck, is to fill up the well deck with water and have an Olympic-sized swimming pool for the crew. It's true that the culture of safety has taken some of the fun away from many Navy traditions, but you have to consider the upside too. If something were to go terribly wrong during a swim call, the commanding officer would be held liable, and swim calls could very well go the way of shellback and tailhook parties into the history books. Swim calls happen more often on aircraft carriers than any other naval vessel. Can you guess the vessel with the least frequent swim calls? Hint, it's not a ship. It's the submarines. I must say, nothing beats using a multi-billion-dollar submarine as a jump pad. But submarine personnel do not pack swimsuits when they go on deployment. According to one submariner, he had 3 swim calls during his 10 years of service. So that's once every 3 and a bit years. But it used to be much more frequent back in the day. because submarines would spend much more time on the surface, which meant more swim calls. But they were more like shower breaks. In fact, as you can see, there is the shower, and there are more sailors bathing than swimming. But then, yet again, as part of Navy's standard operating procedures, someone is assigned to overwatch duty, who usually watches from the sail for any sharks in the area. But sharks were not their biggest worry. It was the dummies who thought they could swim, but found out that they couldn't in the open ocean. Believe it or not, being able to swim is not a prerequisite for joining the US Navy, although basic survival is later taught during the boot camp, which mainly consists of bobbing around. From time to time, submariners from the Russian Navy also enjoy a swim call in the middle of the Arctic Ocean, but it's more like a dip than anything else, for obvious reasons. And yes, there are sharks in the Arctic waters as well, including the Greenland shark, which can live over 500 years. And they spend most of that time looking for a mate. I guess there's plenty of fish, but not a lot of sharks. There is also this guy, the polar bear, which is always hungry. But don't worry, because between 1960 and 2009, there were only 47 polar bear attacks on people. Another common pastime activity on naval ships was drinking. Believe it or not, during the good old days, sailors in the navies around the world would drink daily. For example, in the 17th century, Royal Navy sailors received a gallon of beer each day. Now, it may seem like a lot, but the alcohol content was less than 1% more often than not. Beer was eventually replaced by what became known as a rum ration. Every day, between 11 a.m. and noon, sailors would receive a tot, which was about 3 shots of rum. Petty officers received the rum neat, while lower deck sailors had their rum diluted with 2 parts of water to make about half a pint. But as you know, good things don't last forever. After 239 years, on July 31st, 1970, the rum ration was abolished by the Royal Navy, as the leftovers were tossed over the side one last time. The reason that the rum ran dry was that it was deemed not appropriate to the demands of a modern instant response navy. The sailors, of course, didn't agree with Royal Navy's decision. The Navy compromised by allowing sailors to buy 3 small cans of beer per day, and petty officers will be able to buy 1/8 of a pint of spirits per day, but not rum. Similarly, the Royal Canadian Navy abolished the rum ration in 1972, and yet they still allowed the sale of beer on the warships from vending machines with a daily limit of 2. But you know how it only takes a few to ruin it for everyone? Well, back in 2014, a few sailors got intoxicated and misbehaved while commissioned on HMCS Whitehorse, which forced the warship to be recalled from an international exercise. As a result, the Royal Canadian Navy banned drinking at sea and removed the vending machines. Now they can only have a beer on special occasions or when the captain allows it. But that's still much better than what the American sailors got. The US Navy is arguably the strictest of all when it comes to alcohol consumption. Back in 1794, US Navy sailors received half a pint of distilled spirits per day, with rations being reduced to 1 gill in 1842, and then completely eliminated by 1862. However, sailors were allowed to keep their own stash of liquor until 1899 at the discretion of their commander. But in 1914, the US Navy banned alcohol for the enlisted men with some very few exceptions, such as the wardroom and the captain's wine mess. Another exception was that the ships could have a small stock of alcohol for the so-called medicinal purposes, such as when a crew member is shaken by an accident or a pilot suffering from the pressures of a demanding mission. Alcohol could only be issued by the medical officer or the captain of the ship. During World War II, some submarine commanders would provide a beer to their crew if they sank an enemy warship. In 1980, the US Navy implemented a 45 continuous day rule that brought a beer day to the US Navy. When a ship is at sea for 45 continuous days and has more than 5 days left before coming to port, the ship's captain may authorize a beer day. Once the beer day is held, the crew has to wait another 45 days without a port call until the next beer day. At times, the beer day coincides with the Steel Beach, which is basically a giant party on the deck of any US Navy ship or even a submarine. Steel Beach events began with swim calls and over the years have evolved from sunbathing or playing sports on the deck of aircraft carriers to giant parties that involve barbecues, kiddie pools, carnival games, and live bands. But more often than not, Steel Beach doesn't happen on the same day as a beer day. And when it does, you're supposed to get only 2 beers, but I'm not sure anyone is counting. Steel Beach parties and all other morale-boosting events that we discussed are of course funded by taxpayers' dollars. If you're one of those people who find these expenses unnecessary, here's a story that everyone would be able to relate to. It all started on April Fool's Day 2020, with sailors aboard USS Nimitz starting a 27-day quarantine before leaving their home port of Bremerton. This was the very first carrier strike group to be deployed during the COVID pandemic. Fast forward 274 days to the New Year's Eve of that same year, when the ship was ordered to return home. But only 4 days later, the decision was reversed and USS Nimitz was ordered to stay in her area of operation. On day 294, the crew had a beach day on the carrier's flight deck. To say those sailors deserved it is an understatement. On March 7, 2021, the crew returned home and disembarked, 340 days after having set foot aboard USS Nimitz. This was the longest deployment of any aircraft carrier since the Vietnam War. Serving in the Navy requires a lot of sacrifice from the crew and their families, and things like swim calls, beer days, and Steel Beach parties are the least of what could be done to improve sailors' morale. And of course, nothing, and I mean nothing, is as morale-boosting and as American as shooting guns from a US carrier on the 4th of July.